This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. This episode's all about Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. Published in 1973, Gravity's Rainbow has become one of the most revered American novels of the post-war period. It's a hard novel to summarise, the plot being a complicated tangle of characters and situations, self-referential twists and historical detail, riotous humour and pointed satire. The ostensible protagonist is Tyrone Slothrop, an American GI stationed in London at the end of the Second World War. The city is being hammered by the German V2 bombs, but there is something strange going on. Slothrop keeps a map of London with all of his sexual conquests marked on it, but it appears to mirror the map of the V2 explosions exactly. Believing him to have been conditioned to become aroused at the presence of the plastic used in the bomb's manufacture, a mysterious organisation recruits Slothrop to help find the prototype of a new bomb the Germans are rumoured to be developing. When the war ends, Slothrop is cut loose in Europe in the hope that he will be drawn to this mysterious new rocket bomb. This is a skeleton of the plot, which also involves a Russian spy, a squadron of African soldiers in the German army, the Pavlovian conditioning of dogs, and the life story of a sentient light bulb among many other delights. In his review of Gravity's Rainbow in 99 Novels, Anthony Burgess describes it as the war book to end them all, saying that it describes the obscenity of war in a way that was not available to the poets and novelists writing about the First World War. The enigmatic nature of Gravity's Rainbow is reflected in its author. Thomas Pynchon's reputation as a literary recluse has been talked about endlessly, but the fact that he has not capitalised on his personal celebrity allows the work to speak for itself. He's published 8 novels which range from historical epics such as Mason and Dixon, which tells the story of the surveyors that drew the titular line between the north and south of the United States, to strange detective stories such as Inherent Vice, which plays out in such a cloud of weed smoke that it's uncertain what the detective is actually detecting. His latest novel, Bleeding Edge, was published in 2013, and is set in the run-up to the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York. To help shed some light on Gravity's Rainbow and Thomas Pynchon, we invited Simon Malpas onto the podcast. Simon is a senior lecturer in English literature at Edinburgh University, and has written a great introduction to the works of Thomas Pynchon with Andrew Taylor, which helps demystify many of the themes and philosophies running through Pynchon's novels. If you want to find out more about Simon's book, head to the description of this episode and click on the link provided. I'm Graham Foster of the Burgess Foundation, and I spoke to Simon Malpas in September 2021. Simon, thanks for joining us on the 99 Novels podcast. We're talking today about Gravity's Rainbow. How did you first encounter the novel, and what did you make of it?
It's one of those questions, isn't it? It's possibly the most difficult question to answer. What I made of the novel when I first tried to read it. It was back in the early 1990s. I was at the time just moving from my first degree to do a master's degree in what at the time was very, very popular, which was critical and cultural theory. And as part of that degree, where we were focusing predominantly on sort of critical theoretical material. So it's people like Jacques Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard, Julia Kristeva, looking at ideas of sort of deconstruction, of psychoanalytic criticism, of postmodernism, that this name kept coming up, which was Thomas Pynchon, and this reference which everyone else in the class seemed to have read, Gravity's Rainbow. I should say that my first degree wasn't in English literature; it was in drama. So most of my background was sort of plays, theatre, that sort of thing. And at the time, which was about 1993, I suspect, I just got this sense that Gravity's Rainbow was the book I had to read if I was going to understand, what literature could be. Everyone said it was unreadable. Everyone said it was impossible. Everyone said it was the most exciting text in the whole world ever. And I suspect most of the people that were talking about it most had actually not read it. So I toddled off, bought a copy, sat down, and was pretty much had my breath taken away by everything. I don't think I understood much of what was going on. I didn't have, in the sense, that enough of the history, enough of the context to really grasp it. I certainly didn't have enough sense of the sort of the narratological games that are being played in the text. But throughout, images, moments, ideas just kept accumulating, building up. I probably couldn't have retold the plot. I probably can't retell the plot in any great detail now, but so much of it stuck with me. It was, as I say, it was about 1993-ish, right at the height of the Bosnian War. And the sense in the text that struck me at the time was this sense of movement and populations on the move and refugees, and this is a war novel. I think we're going to go and talk about this as a war novel because one of the things that Burgess does is identify it as specifically as a war novel in his very short review. But one of the things about it is it was a war novel without battles, but it was a war novel that looked at the impact of war on the people caught up in it, the people surrounded by it. And I think that was what really first struck me about Gravity's Rainbow. As I say, didn't get it all. But I was drawn in by the complexity, the range, and the variety of tones, of styles. But equally, those moments of hilarity and horror that are caught up in the focus of the sidelines, as it were. So I think that's my opening response to it. I've read it many times since, finding different things in it. But my original impression, as I say, is that it was a novel that was incomprehensible, but fascinating, and fun and exciting, and contained all sorts of things that are immediately, vivid, memorable, etc.
Yeah, I think that's how a lot of people first encounter Gravity's Rainbow or Pynchon's work more generally, and I think that mirrors my own first experiences of Gravity's Rainbow as something that feels important at a sort of instinctual level, but it takes a while for the brain to catch up.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, exactly that. I mean, I think, as I say, there was a sense, certainly at the time in the early 90s, that it was an important text to read because it was a text that was talking about the present. So, in terms of sort of theories of meaning, of ideas about what a novel could or might be able to do, this was exactly that example. But it was also, as I say, a novel that seemed to me at the time, and it has seemed since in different contexts, to have something really quite important to say, even if I couldn't identify exactly what it was saying, about the moment, about the world in which we were living.
Why do you think Burgess included Gravity's Rainbow. He says in his review he couldn't decide if he was going to put V or The Crying of Lot 49 or Gravity's Rainbow in his selection. Why do you think he settled on Gravity's Rainbow?
It's a good question. And I think it's quite an important question because from the review itself, I don't get the impression that he'd necessarily finished it. The review cuts off about sort of 200 pages in terms of context, and there's no indication of anything that happens after it. I think, though, that Gravity's Rainbow, certainly at the time in the mid 80s, was considered to be the Pynchon book. This was the masterpiece. People were already, critics like Tony Tanner were already calling it the candidate for the next great American novel. The post World War II version of Ulysses, etc. And there's clearly a sense of that in what Burgess says about Gravity's Rainbow, where he talks about reading it in the light of Paul Fussell's The Great War in Modern Memory, and the sense that the novel is doing something new, doing something original. And in the introduction to the 99 novels, he's very, very keen on that idea of, he's choosing the novels. He says, I've concentrated mainly on works which have brought something new in technique or view of the world to the form. So not necessarily the best novels, but those novels that have been innovative, that have changed things. And I think what he picks up on quite brilliantly is the way in which Gravity's Rainbow does that. Lot 49 and V, he says, are playing brilliant higher games with the novel form, but in Gravity's Rainbow, those games, the narrative innovations, the narrative experimentations, somehow touch down in a world that we all live in a way that has the capacity to, as you put it, do something profound. And I think that's why Burgess, given Burgess's other interests in his writing, given what he's doing at that period, as far as I know, I'm not the expert on Burgess that you guys are, but what he's doing in that period seems to me that Gravity's Rainbow is the one that best fits this sort of thing he's trying to construct in 99 novels.
I think you're right, and I think actually what Burgess was doing throughout the 70s, and whether or not the influence of Pynchon was part of that, was much more experimental than his 1960s work. If you look at books like MF, which is an extremely experimental novel, and even sort of smaller books like Beards, Roman Women, for example, is that has these sort of strange experiments that seem to be commenting on the fictional world and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And of course, the Napoleon Symphony, which is his most experimental novel, which is the story of Napoleon's life, structured around Beethoven's Eroica, which it sort of goes even beyond Pynchon with its sort of ambitions. But you also mentioned that you didn't think Burgess had read the whole book, which is interesting because the only copy we have in the archive is a first edition, which has the first 100 pages is replicated at the back of the book instead of the last 100 pages. So there's a printing error in it. So if that's the only copy of Gravity's Rainbow that he ever picked up, then he certainly hasn't read the final 100 pages.
That's a really interesting point. I think, as I say, it's. I'm not accusing him of pretending to have read it or something. It's on the basis of what he writes that it just seems to me that there's a very insightful account of I say, the first 250 pages. Just in that very, very brief review, I mean, what he does brilliantly is pick up very acutely 2 or 3 really key points, but there is nothing about anything after that. And and there's no indication in the way in which he's talking about those 2 or 3 key points. So he focuses on the Special Operations Executive, the Second World War, but nothing about what they become as the novel progresses. Nothing about the sort of the later material that's going on in the zone and the novel's projection of a sort of post-war economy, of a post-war world. So I think there's definitely there's something there, but it's very interesting that his copy didn't have the last 100 pages. Given the last 100 pages of the novel, and given that that's the place where readers most struggle, it's possible he could have read the first 100 pages again.
I guess so, yeah.
Much more as something like Finnegan's Wake, the circular novel.
I think also where he's coming to Pynchon as well is through his wife Liana, who was Pynchon's Italian translator. So she translated V and The Crying of Lot 49. So I'm sure they would have had conversations over the dinner table about Pynchon's work. It was Liana, at the time they met, it was Liana's main literary output was the translation of Pynchon's novels. So, maybe that has sort of controlled the way Burgess thinks of Pynchon's work and Gravity's Rainbow more specifically.
I'm sure you're right about that. No, I think that makes perfect sense and gives that sort of biographical basis to thinking about it. But I think along with all of that, that Gravity's Rainbow actually, if you look at the other 98 novels, does fit in there quite well.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
So I think it has the importance that makes it a legitimate part of the book, over and above the sort of the as you say, the interest that clearly Burgess will have had in Pynchon more generally. I think Burgess is it seems to me very like Pynchon in the sort of the encyclopedic nature of his interests, and really fierce sort of intellectual intelligence behind a lot of his work, a lot of his writing. I still, it's almost never mentioned, but his 1985. I still think is one of the most fascinating publications, because of that mixture of critique analysis and its wild analysis of 1984, followed by a really very disturbingly bleak text. So I mean, I think you're right. The novels you mentioned about from the 70s are really important, but I put a claim in there for 1985. I think it's underappreciated in many ways, and I think again relatively Pynchonesque in what it's doing, in how it's working.
That's interesting. So we've talked very briefly about Gravity's Rainbow as a war novel, and it's something that Burgess identifies, and certainly from my point of view, it's not just about World War II, even though that's when the novel is set. It's also about the Cold War, and I would say Vietnam, which was going on when Pynchon was writing the novel. Would you categorize it as a war novel? And how do you think it compares to the more traditional war novels, say like The Naked and the Dead, which was published at a similar time, or even Catch-22?
It's a war novel without battles. I mean, if you notice, there are comparatively few soldiers in the novel. There's the Schwartz Commando, the Southwest African sort of figures who are trying to remake the 50 rocket for their own means. There's Major Marvey, and a wonderful sort of parody of sort of toxic American masculinity, to put it in contemporary terms, with his group. But pretty much everyone else in the novel is either a sort of part of the sort of the broader sort of sense of this sort of special operations executive, the intellectuals sort of working behind the scenes, to persuade, to sort of generate victory, by none immediately military means. The focus there is not on the grand schemes, but what is going on behind. Very early on in the novel, we're told the war, the conflict, isn't what is important. So there's a line sort of in the first, just after the first 100 pages, he says, where someone says, don't forget the real business of the war is buying and selling. The murdering and the violence, self-policing, and can be entrusted to non-professionals. The mass nature of wartime death is useful in many ways. It serves as spectacle, as diversion from the real movement of the war. The true war is a celebration of the markets. So if this is a war novel, it's looking at the tensions, the figures that are going on behind the war. As you say, it's set, historically set in late 1944, 1945, in Europe that the war has sort of travelled across, looking at the residue, looking at in what's called the zone, where a good deal of the novel is set after it moves out of London. You have this space that is unpoliced, that is anarchic, that the populations are sort of moving back and forth across. You've got all of these different little micro groups who are representing different possibilities, different shapes, all of which are paranoid that there is something outside, something we don't know about. And this is how the novel works in terms of this paranoia, that there is a they with a capital T, behind the scenes, pulling the strings, and all of the characters, everything we see in the novel as we're reading it, could simply be the puppets, being manipulated by this business that is going on behind the scenes. So my reading of it is it is a war novel, but it's a novel that is interested in the consequences of war, both on individuals, on other groups, but also the consequences, what happens after the war. So as you say, the Cold War, and eventually the Vietnam War. It ends in a cinema, presumably in a cinema in the 1970s, with a rocket about to descend on it, or possibly ends, as other critics have read, in the mind of a shell-shocked Vietnam veteran in a hospital who's dreaming about the characters that we see, earlier in the novel. So it's, I think as a war novel, it's a novel with a slightly different focus than certainly than the heroics of war, or even the fighting itself. What is at stake in the novel very often is the competition between the various factions to commandeer, to take control of a future that is going to be shaped by, first of all, rocketry. So the V2 rocket becomes, as the 20th century progresses, both the Apollo rocket and the sort of the basis of the intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are, shaping the standoff in the Cold War. But equally, everything else that is there, the development of plastic. Plastic, it plays a big part in it. The global reach of the sort of the various cartels. So Esso is mentioned, Shell are mentioned, IG Farben plays a key part in it. So the way in which international capitalism emerges, that was really coming to the fore in the 1970s, 1980s, emerges out of the competition at the end of the war. Does that make sense as a...
It does, and I think one thing that struck me when I was listening to you talk there is that perhaps we could describe Gravity's Rainbow as a novel about the almost the death of traditional war and the birth of essentially what we see in the world now, which is war that is fought without soldiers, like cyber war, or the Cold War, or that sort of political war, rather than sort of boots on the ground war.
Mm.
Um, and perhaps that's what Pynchon is pointing towards.
I think that's absolutely it. As I say, I mean, I first read it in the 90s during the Bosnian War, and was absolutely struck by that sense of the desolation that is caused by modern weaponry, and the fact that the victims of that war are, much less the fighting forces, but actually the civilians who are caught up in it. So the novel starts, the famous opening line of "Screaming comes across the sky," with an evacuation. The rockets are coming in, and the people are evacuating. But already, in the very opening sentences, we're told that it's too late because of the nature of the V2 rocket that is traveling faster than sound. The moment by the time you've heard it, it's already landed. So there is this incredible opening vignette of a group of civilians, desperately trying to evacuate from what they perceive to be the site the rocket is going to land, which has this sense of doom. They've missed it. They're dead already. That becomes someone's dream. It becomes the nightmare. So, as we read those opening pages, we move from this moment of the rocket being seen, the rocket being heard, to the consequences, the people desperately getting away from the scene of the explosion, trying to get away from the scene of the explosion, trying to escape a fate that has already happened. They're already too late, which then becomes a dream, a paranoid nightmare that one of the characters, one of the central characters, Pirate Prentice, is having. That then moves into this very, very strange account of growing bananas on the tops of London flats and having a big sort of banana fry up for your breakfast, etc. That is repeated about sort of 3/4 of the way through the novel. With, again, one of the pieces I read when I first read the novel and had no idea at that stage what was going on, but an incredible 2 or 3 pages, about 1,000 words in about 3 sentences, I think, 2 very short sentences, then an astonishingly long one. This idea of what's going on at the end of the war, this idea of the nationalities are on the move. It's a great frontierless streaming out here, followed by this series of very brief clauses describing the different nationalities: the Volksdeutsch, the Rostock, the Poles, the Estonians, the Letts, the Lithuanians, the Sudetans, the East Prussians, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Croats, the Serbs, the Turks, the Gegs, the Macedonians, the Magyars, the Vlachs, the Caucasians, the Spaniards, etc., etc. In this one incredibly long sentence about migration, and about this internal sort of stateless migration in the center of Europe, that's been generated by the war, where everything changes. Everything has been lost. Everything that made sense of the past, their traditions, their beliefs, their possessions are being scattered. So caravans of gypsies, axles or linchpins failing, horses dying, families leaving vehicles beside the roads for others to come live in a night, a day. So populations move across the open meadow, limping, marching, shuffling, carried, hauling along the detritus of an order, a European and bourgeois order they don't yet know is destroyed forever. So again, the sense the novel plays with this sort of subjunctive future perfect, that no one quite, at the moment that something is happening to you, you don't quite know what that means. You don't quite realize, you can't quite realize what's actually going on behind your back, as it were. So, so there's a sense, I suppose, of the key guiding structure. My reading of the novel, at least, is paranoia, and that is the modern condition.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
that sort of view has gone quite mainstream in the world right now, I suppose.
I think it has. I think certainly in the 1970s, when the novel was being written, there was absolutely a sense of a sort of paranoid politics that was, certainly in the United States, with Nixon, etc. Nixon, of course, makes an appearance as Richard Slub in the novel.
Mm.
One of Pynchon's less artistic parodies. I think that the anger there is clearly just distaste for this guy. Um, but certainly there is that sense in, prevalent in the 70s of a real genuine, paranoia. There are people out to get us. Um, the 60s, the optimism of the 60s has begun to fade. Um, you have the oil crises. You have in Britain the sort of 3-day weeks and the continual sort of elections and collapses of government. But even nowadays, there is again that sense that there are what we do is controlled. We communicate through media that other people have access to. Other people can have our data. That we're being continually sort of manipulated. And I think that again lies at the center of one of the things the novel is doing. We know very little about Pynchon biographically, but we do know that one of the few things that has been released about him is that his ancestor was one of the first American settlers, William Pynchon, who got into terrible trouble by writing a tract that upset the governors of the states, a sort of religious tract. And this gets played out again in Gravity's Rainbow. There's the central character Slothrop. His ancestor William Slothrop writes a book on preterition, and it plays with this Calvinist distinction between the elect, those people who are going to be saved no matter what, and the preterite, the left behind, those people who are not part of the elect community, who are not going to be saved. And William Slothrop, the ancestor, writes a book on preterition, where he claims that the preterite are essential, and you can only have an elect in relation to this preterite. And that upsets the people in power, and he's exiled for it. And that comes back in the novel. The focus of the characters, all of the characters in the novel, have this sort of paranoid feeling that they are not amongst the saved, that there is this shadowy they, or the firm, or the system, all of which capitalized, that is going on behind their backs, that is in control of the world, and that these poor sort of preterite souls are doomed, irrespective of what they do. Um, but that paranoid structure, I think, structures are through the narrative structures our approach into the world and our sense of what that world is doing.
Yeah, I think you've talked quite well about the politics of the novel there, and the subjects of the novel are quite wide. So obviously, to some extent, it's about war. You've just mentioned there the American history aspect of it with the colonial settlers, the consequences of that colonialism as well, and the consequences of colonialism in Europe, which you mentioned with the migration of the displaced people after the war, and the global order of capital you mentioned as well. With all of these, I mean, we could probably talk forever about what Pynchon is trying to say about all these things, but one of the accusations leveled Pynchon is that his novels are sort of devoid of a moral point of view. Would you agree with that, or do you think Gravity's Rainbow, in particular, is a novel that has a moral objective?
That's a really difficult question, a really important question, but a very, very difficult one to answer. I would say the novel Gravity's Rainbow, but I think all of the novels are resolutely interested in morality and the possibilities of morality, but finally and equally resolutely refuse to offer a moral message that the way, I mean, again, if we take the specificity of Gravity's Rainbow, the final section of the novel is called the counterforce, and what we some of what we see in that final section. There's an awful lot of other stuff going on, some of which is just bizarre. Is the sort of the getting together of a sort of resistance movement within what began as the Special Operations Executive, that sets itself up as a counterforce to the system, to the firm, and it comes to challenge the sort of the globalization that is going on with setting, challenge the setting of this sort of new world order after the war. But their resistance is pretty futile. It's gesture politics. It's invading a dinner party and poisoning the food so that everyone throws up. It's one of the characters, Roger Mexico, leaping on the table and urinating on all the guests. But they never actually achieve anything. It becomes this sort of it's a staged happening in that 1960s sense, but it doesn't get anywhere. Where we get to at the end is this sort of fading out, this fading into a present. So I don't think there's a message. I don't think there's a moral. I don't think, in any sense, this novel is preachy. If that's a not too crude a way of putting it. What I think it does is the novel unsettles, the novel disturbs, the novel, through the sort of the paranoid focalization of the narrative, puts the onus back on us, asks us questions. The frustration of the novel is it doesn't tell us, what to think, what the answers are, but it solicits us to think. It's why I think Gravity's Rainbow is so absolutely rereadable, because you end frustrated. You can very easily get to the end and go immediately back to the beginning and want to start again. Because this time it will make sense. This time it will all fit together. But I think Gravity's Rainbow, more than any other Pynchon before or since, is a novel that doesn't fit together. It's, again, the narrative of the novel will solicit us directly. The use of the second person in the narrative, it refers again towards the end even more so to you, continually addressing directly whoever's reading it, not giving them answers, but just provoking, just prodding, just pushing. And I think, again, going back to my original reading of the novel, that was the sense I got of it, and it's a sense that's never left me. That it's a novel that you bring a lot of yourself to, because there isn't a sort of an central authorial figure that you can say, well, clearly, what I know biographically about the author is this, and therefore it must be, a conservative novel or a socialist novel or a revolutionary novel, because those are the politics. I don't think it allows you that comfort of settling down and thinking and ticking the box and saying, I've solved this. It's an itch that you keep scratching.
Right, yeah. And I mean, quite a lot of critics, I've forgotten who said it. Was it Brian McHale that said that the novel is unreadable in a sense that that it resists interpretation. It can't be interpreted in the same way as another novel might be. And you've sort of described the role of the reader in that in
Mm.
that the reader is perhaps mimicking the roles of the characters who, if you take the what we can call the protagonist, Tyrone Slothrop, he's trying to make sense of the world
Mm.
of the novel as he moves through it. But the reader is also trying to make sense of that world at the same time as Slothrop, and we're never ahead of him really in what we know. So do you think there's that performative aspect to the novel?
I think that's exactly it. Yeah, the reader is placed in that same, preterite, paranoid position as Slothrop. There's a wonderful moment where Slothrop acknowledges his own paranoia and says, actually, what paranoia is making connections. It's taking this sort of random, all these events that sort of keep hitting me, all these incidents that keep happening to me, and trying to find a connection between them, trying to make sense of them, trying to sort of fit them together. And paranoia is, in that sense, for Slothrop is this hermeneutic drive to relate the various events and into a bigger system, a bigger narrative. And he says, there is this moment where he says, what terrifies me is the fact that there might be no system, there might be no connections, that all of this might be entirely random. And I think what's interesting about Slothrop is he disappears. As a protagonist, he's very, very odd because about 100 pages before the end, he vanishes. He sort of disappears in a sort of in a in a puff of signifiers that never really quite fit together. He's recalled later by this figure, this voice in the sort of the Veterans Hospital. But whether he actually even ever existed is itself sort of called into question.
I suppose even before that he is removed from the
Mm.
narrative almost completely. He throughout the novel he disappears and he's off having his adventures, and we are forced to focus on another character, whether that's Roger Mexico or
Mm.
the Russian spy,
Yeah,
Chicherin, I
Irene.
think his name is.
Yeah.
And we're forced to go where Pynchon wants us to look, where
Mm.
and Slothrop's off there somewhere in the world doing his thing, but we don't find out about that really.
That's exactly it. I mean, with a novel with 400 characters, at least
Mm.
400 named characters, all of whom are sort of introduced, and none of whom you know whether they're going to return or reappear. And oddly enough, the character who is focal at the end of the novel is someone who is very briefly introduced at the very beginning as someone's, as someone's half brother, vanishes for 700 pages, and then ends up being the sort of the central sacrificial figure. This poor guy called Gottfried. That characters there's the character Laszlo Jamf, who is possibly the sort of the root cause of Slothrop. um, who is later described as almost, as possibly even made up, never having existed in the first place. So I think that shifting in and out of focus is something that is crucial to the novel. There's critic Leo Bassani who picks up on McHale's reading and compares Gravity's Rainbow to Ulysses. And he says that the puzzles in Ulysses are like the stations of the cross, and they're ritual agonies through which we must pass in order finally to be at one. Whereas in Gravity's Rainbow, you have the sort of the dissolution of solutions, as it were. I often read, Crying of Lot 49, it's like the earlier novel by Pynchon, I read as a sort of inverse detective fiction. You start with some certainty, and as every new clue appears, you become less and less certain. Oedipa Maas, who's the sort of the central detective figure, gradually you have this spreading out of possibilities as more and more possibilities accrue, rather than a sort of a narrowing down of the possibilities as a detective sorts through the clues. And I think again, Gravity's Rainbow does a similar thing. It leaves us in more uncertainty at the end than we ever probably were at the beginning.
I think that's what Pynchon's doing in a lot of his novels. Actually, I think if you boil the novels right down to their essence, they are quest narratives. Pretty much
Yeah.
all of his novels are quest narratives, I would say. Um, and really, the backbone is quite traditional. He sets up, these people are looking for this thing, or
Mm.
these people are attempting to achieve this thing. So in the case of Mason and Dixon, they're trying to draw a line across America, essentially,
Yeah.
to divide the early states. Um, and it's where he goes from there that completely blows up that. But that they all begin with this sort of quest. Um, do you think that's fair to
I think
to
that's
say?
entirely fair. Absolutely. Yes, everything from V at the very beginning, where you've got stencils, sort of paranoid line drawing, systematizing, and Benny Profane's sort of random wandering. There's still that sense, through the 20th century of the quest to find the identity of V, in the various manifestations, right through to Bleeding Edge,
Mm,
which is the sort of, to put it very crudely, the 9/11 novel.
mm,
I think a novel that really does require a lot more discussion. I'm supervising a PhD student who's working on this, and is finding some fascinating stuff about it. But again, there is definitely that sense of a quest, but a quest that is never quite resolved, a narrative that never quite ends in closure, in reconciliation. Bleeding Edge, I think, comes closer to that. Maybe Pynchon sort of mellowing in his old age,
right.
but and there's nothing I think ends quite in the way that Gravity's Rainbow does.
Mm,
But I think that certainly is a key part of yes, what his writing is doing. As you say, Mason and Dixon is a similar. You can read Mason and Dixon very simply as a historical text, but everything else, everything that makes it the text it is going on in the sort of in the margins and challenging that idea of the sort of a narrative of history that has a meaning, that has a result, that has an end point, um, that is clear, is unquestionable, has a moral, has a message. Pynchon tantalizes us with the possibility of morality, um, and that's what makes him fascinating. But he withholds that, and that's what makes him rereadable, and eminently rereadable.
I think it's magnetic, isn't it? Once you've
Hmm.
caught the bug, once you've sort of unlocked the way he writes,
Hmm.
it's compelling. You want more of it,
Yeah,
and you just want to be immersed in it. And having recorded this, I'm struggling now not to immediately finish recording this and go read all of his books again in one mass frenzy. Um,
I think
but
I feel the same. To be quite honest.
um, and just a sort of more general question: what do you think Pynchon's legacy is now? And do you see his influence in fiction being published today?
I think I'm going to take the cop out, of not the cop out, but that sense of the Chinese ambassador when asked about the legacy of the French Revolution and say it's too soon to tell.
Right.
I think we can certainly trace very clear continuities with but equally differences, with writers like David Foster Wallace, who I think brilliantly important, brilliantly fascinating, and with a lot of the sort of the experimental writing that's going on, in the States and in Britain at the moment. Even you know in the 1980s when Burgess was publishing this, I think writers such as Rushdie, um, were Salman Rushdie were very clearly drawing on some of the sort of the innovations that Pynchon had made. But other writers like than Pynchon, like um, John Barth, um, Coover, Barthelmy. Um, there is a sense, and certainly one of the things I mentioned in another book, um, that the sort of playfulness of that writing, um, is something that in the 21st century was challenged pretty hard. One of the the first sort of comments after September the 11th was a Time magazine article that declared that the age of irony was over. That we needed sort of to get back to realism. We needed to get back to clarity. We needed to get back to sort of moral, unambiguity. And I sense there's a lot of still a desire for that, an urge for that, in a lot of writing nowadays. But I think that playfulness is something that is in what I find the interesting writing nowadays. I mean, and that can range from someone like Jeanette Winterson, to Katsuo Ishiguro, to actually the genre writing, science fiction writing, someone like Peter Watts or Greg Egan. In Scotland, someone like Charles Stross or Ian Banks, late Ian Banks. There is that capacity to play, capacity to sort of withhold immediate satisfaction. What I'd say, going back to John Keats and the Romantics, that idea of negative capability, the pleasure of being in uncertainties without sort of infinite striving after fact and reason, as Keats in a letter puts it, as having an aesthetic payoff, as having a pleasure associated with it. And I think I can't trace a clear legacy. I don't want to trace a sort of genealogy from Pynchon to, obviously someone like David Foster Wallace, as a particular genre or a particular trend in writing. But I think Pynchon having happened, or Pynchon continuing, I hope to happen. I mean, hoping there's going to be another novel. Then writing itself, literature itself, can't retreat from that, and shouldn't retreat from that.
Okay, and one final question, one question that we're going to ask everybody on the 99 Novels podcast. If you could add 100th novel to Burgess's list, what would it be and why?
This is the question I wish you hadn't given me any prior notice of, because I've been racking my brains about this for ever since you first asked. Looking at the list, and given that I've been asked to talk about Gravity's Rainbow, I think I'd go for another novel from the 70s, which is, there's numerous ones I could choose. Anything from a sort of a nice light P.G. Wodehouse, one of the later P.G. Wodehouse novels, to something much more canonically sort of central. But given that sense that he's interested in experimental and what one can do with fiction that hasn't been done before, there's a novel by an American writer called Samuel Delany, called Dahlgren. Delany is an African American writer, and Dahlgren, from novel from the mid 70s, I think from 1974, is a sort of a science fiction novel, but it's a broadly dystopian novel. It's set in a town called Bologna, which is a town right at the center of the United States. But some sort of revolution has happened. Something has happened, and the town's order has disappeared. And it becomes a place where a series of sort of countercultural gangs are wandering around. There's a few sort of bourgeois families that are sort of clinging on by their fingernails. And it's a novel that seems to me in some ways a sort of companion piece to Gravity's Rainbow, but equally is doing a similar thing. It has been called the African American Ulysses. Has been, just as Gravity's Rainbow is sort of the postmodern Ulysses. It's always also been called, sort of been referred to as the LGBT Ulysses. It's a very, very experimental novel. It's a very, very complex, challenging, again, very funny, but very bleak and at times disturbing novel. That's like Finnegan's Wake, sort of begins halfway through a sentence and ends with what we assume to be the first half of that sentence. But it's a novel that explores the consequences of the American counterculture in I think a more direct way than Gravity's Rainbow does. But I think looking at that list of 99 novels, I think it's one that could interestingly fit into it. So that would be my answer, I think.
Great. Thanks for joining us on this podcast to talk about Gravity's Rainbow. I think I'm hoping that our conversation has turned a lot of people on to what an amazing book Gravity's Rainbow is.
Well, thank you, Graham, and thank you for asking some really, really perceptive and helpful questions. It's been great to talk about it. One should never stop talking about Pynchon. There's always more to say, and in talking, you discover things that you hadn't realised you'd already known.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Graham.
You have been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Thomas Pynchon by Simon Malpas and Andrew Taylor is published by Manchester University Press and available now. If you'd like to get involved in the 99 Novels conversation and tell us what 100th novel you would add to the list, you can use the hashtag 99novels on Twitter. To find out more about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit www.anthonyburgess.org. The theme music is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor. It's performed by No Dice Collective, who can be found online at nodicecollective.com. If you have enjoyed this podcast, why not leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts?